Hello there, everyone. I'm Lisa Millar, and this is Leigh Sales. And yes, hi, welcome.
Hello.
We acknowledge this land that we meet on today as the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their culture and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We were just having a little giggle then when we were told the microphones were live, because Leigh was trying to find someone in the crowd and she was at risk of saying things. The microphone is live, Leigh. Honestly, you would think by now that she was an actual professional, but I tell you...
Now, can I, right off the top, I just want to clear up a slight misconception with the banner saying Storytellers chaired by Lisa Millar. It's actually a session with the pair of us in conversation about both Storytellers, which is my latest book, but also Lisa's latest book, which is called Muster Dogs from Pups to Pros. And I would hate anyone to be under the impression that a journalist as accomplished and talented as Lisa Millar, and a great writer and journalist in her own right, is simply here to hold my purse and just chair my session. So it's actually a joint session where we're talking about both of our books.
Well, the funny thing is we actually have the same purse, because as besties going back a long way, yes, we've found that we have a lot of things in common, Look, actually, I'm just super relieved that we are here and starting this session on time, because at 5:52 a.m, I sent Leigh a text message and I said, "Salesy, I've just had the worst nightmare ever. I dreamt that we were late for our session." I said we were trying to get a car and people were telling me that Adelaide traffic was terrible and that we should have in fact walked from the hotel. But then people gave us the wrong directions, and then I was trying to cool down and chill, and so I went for a walk and then got massively lost. And so I said, "Do you mind if we meet in the lobby a little earlier?"
And I knew even before the request, I thought she'd like to go a little bit earlier. And this has been a bit of I thought I'd give you a bit of context of our friendship, which time has always been a big factor of it. And the nature of what we've done with news reporting, time right down to the second is often very important. And Lisa and I actually met, she was working at the ABC in Queensland. I'd left Queensland. Lisa Millar, you'd get on incredibly well with her. This was in the mid-1990s. And there was a dinner that had been organised at a Chinese restaurant in Toowong, and I tried to be fashionably late, and I never can be. I'm always early or on time, almost always. And I walk in and there's one person already seated at the table, and it's Lisa Millar. And I said to her, I always try to be on time, but I'm always early. And she went, "Oh, so am I." And then, we pretty much left the dinner best friends, and it's remained that way ever since.
Yeah, and look, it's worked well over the years that we have generally turned up early for everything. We can't help ourselves, apart from one moment.
I knew she'd bring this up.
Which has probably led to my nightmare anxiety this morning, which was in 2002, and we had been foreign correspondents for the ABC in Washington together for a matter of months. And it was post-September 11. There was a lot of tension still in Washington, D.C. They still had fighter jets flying overhead, protecting the city. And there was a press conference being held at the Pentagon with Donald Trump, the then Defence Secretary. Rumsfeld, sorry. God, Donald Rumsfeld. Wow, that's a Freudian slip. I bet he would have if he could have. Donald Rumsfeld and the former Senator Robert Hill, who was the Defence Minister for Australia.
South Australian, in fact.
Yes, South Australian. And I thought you were going to correct me then again.
No,
I thought, no, you're making me nervous, girlfriend. You're making me nervous. Anyway, I had said... I turned up at Leigh's house and we were going to get a taxi to the Pentagon, and Leigh said, "Oh, why don't we leave at 11:15 for a midday press conference? Why don't you tell the rest of the story, Leigh?"
And so Lisa was like, "I would really like to leave now." And I was like, "Chill out. We don't need to get there, half an hour early. It's going to take 15 minutes. The cab drops us at the Pentagon. Because we've never been to the Pentagon before, the clue is in the name. It is a large pentagonal-shaped building.
5 sides.
With multiple
5 entrances.
And the cab dropped us at the wrong entrance. And because it was post 9/11, when all the security was really ramped up, we're kind of walking from entrance to entrance, and everyone's got, their guns, and who are these randoms trying to walk in? And eventually we were in grave danger of missing the start of the press conference. And Lisa was kind of not saying anything, but the steam was just coming out of her ears. But she still loves me.
I do, but hence it is lovely to be with you all here today on time.
And look, how we thought we would work this session is Storytellers is basically about the craft of storytelling, and I believe it of course can be an art, but I also believe that it is a craft and that it is something that you kind of learn by doing and by observing people who are good at this particular craft. And so we thought we might talk about some of the principles that make great storytelling, non-fiction, as we work in, but then use Lisa's book to illustrate some of the points that we're talking about, because she, recently her Mustard Dogs book had to be turned around. How long did you have for it? It was super quick.
Oh, about 4 months, with the encouragement of my best friend here, who, when I rang her and said, and I don't know if you've caught up with Mustard Dogs on the ABC, on iView, so it's been thanks to the ABC, apart from Bluey. Bluey, damn that dog Bluey. I mean, Bluey beats us in the ratings, but Mustard Dogs is right up there with it. And it's been such a wonderful experience for me to be employed with that project, because it's such a beautiful project, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But when the second series was being pulled together, the first series on Kelpies, the second series on Border Collies, for those who haven't seen it, they asked me whether I would write a book to accompany the show, and they wanted 70,000, 75,000 words, and they wanted it in 4 months. And so I rang Leigh, as we often do, to get advice from each other. And I said to her, geez, Salesy, do you reckon I can write 70,000 words in 4 months?
Bear in mind, she gets up at 3 a.m. 5 days a week to host news breakfast for 3 hours at a time.
And Salesy said, no way.
I was like, this is an act of absolute madness. Why would you sign up to this?
Yeah, she actually suggested that it might kill me.
And showing her degree of respect for my wisdom and advice, she went ahead.
Yes. And I wrote the book and I got it done, and we'll be speaking a little bit about that as we go on. But Leigh is right when she talks about storytellers being something not just for those in the trade. It was not just about the trade secrets of an incredible number of people at the top of their game, whether they were journalists or editors or camera crews, even the bosses who make the decisions about it. But and in your book, Leigh, you give that example of even a pilot describing a flight delay to passengers is telling a story. Everyone tells stories. You all tell stories with the way you engage with friends. Some people tell stories better than others.
Absolutely. Or, every time you write a Facebook post or an Instagram post, it is a form of storytelling. If you tell your husband and wife what your day was like at work, it's a form of storytelling. And we all know people who seem naturally great at that, and then, people who waffle or they don't know. I once read this wonderful line by Helen Garner talking about her mother, and she said, she was a woman who couldn't tell an anecdote, and she said she would start stories days, weeks, or even months before their correct beginning. We all know those people. And so a lot of the things that professional storytellers use are extremely useful tools in life, and are extremely useful tools, in many, many workplace series of conversations, very, very interesting ones. The core theme, I think, that came through from every single person really is that at the heart of storytelling is the interest in other human beings and curiosity about the way the world works. And I think that is, unless you're kind of walking through life and thinking, oh, that's interesting, and noticing what you're finding interesting, it's hard to then find your way to being a good storyteller.
I just remembered actually something about the beginnings of your book. There was this term in Washington that when books were published, people would do a Washington read, which was to go straight to the index to see if they were actually in it or not. And if they weren't in it, they didn't bother reading it. Yeah. And I have started, I love reading the acknowledgements of books.
Yeah, same,
and,
yeah.
Oh, I love it. And it often gives me a feel for the writer before you then get into the actual book. And I remember when I wrote the acknowledgements to my memoir, Daring to Fly, I put so much effort into it, and because it was all about my family and my parents who'd passed away, and you know, I'd often cry just trying to write this acknowledgement. And I cried as well trying to write the acknowledgement for Mustard Dogs. But anyway, so when Salesy, you know, the book comes out and I get my copy and I read the acknowledgements and I'm right up there at the beginning. And that makes me feel very special.
Oh, well, do you know what? I hate to raise this, but I also am a fan of reading acknowledgements, and I actually think they tend to go in ascending order of love and importance, because you know what? So often they end with, and can I thank my beloved wife, blah, 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 blah. And so the fact that you were first, I'm just...
For those who can't see Leigh at the moment, she's shrugging her shoulders. We're going to be discussing this later. Well, one of the reasons I saw my name there initially and I thought, oh, that's great, because I had been a very big support to her during this process. I had...
Not as big as the people that came after you on the list, but nonetheless, you're quite right.
I had read each of the chapters that you had sent through. I'd even got my sister to read a couple because you wanted to get a sense of how people who weren't in journalism felt about what was being written. And then, so Leigh says, and thank you very much, you know, to my two dear friends, and actually this is why I do think it was very important, is that Annabelle Crabb was there as well. So, but do you know why I was thanked? Because Leigh then wrote, and thank you to Lisa, who was my first interviewee and enabled me to work out whether I was using the audio equipment properly. So yet again, so this then goes to the whole chair thing that basically I'm Leigh's PA. Anyway, she did get the recording right.
I did.
And we had a really interesting chat. And you then went on to interview a whole lot of other people. So talk about how you chose who you spoke to.
Well, it was just, look, it's absolutely not the definitive list of, you know, the top media practitioners or storytellers in the country.
I mean, you could have interviewed 100
Absolutely.
different people.
There's a million people you could have interviewed. In fact, Ben Ball, my publisher at Simon & Schuster, who's here, early on when we were making the list, we batted around additional names. And one thing that we talked quite a lot about actually was whether there should be a dedicated chapter to sports journalism, which is obviously in Australia, like, it's very important, and there are some absolutely incredibly gifted sports journalists from, you know, broadcast people like Bruce McAvaney right through to Gideon Haigh writing about cricket and so forth. And so there were just so many different ways that you could have taken it. So it was kind of governed a bit by, I wanted people that had different experiences and different skill sets. I wanted, obviously, diversity in there. And then, obviously, people who I had, because I've, you know, crusty old bag who's been around for a long time, I've worked with a lot of people. And so I knew that there were people who had rich and interesting backgrounds and stories to tell. So, for example, Lisa will no doubt, when we're talking about Mustard Dogs, refer to a woman with whom we're friends named Pamela Williams, who is a great journalist at the Australian Financial Review, who retired recently, you know, 6 Walkley Awards later. And Pam, because I was her friend, knew her backstory, which was that she had been a woman who was kind of a hippie living in the Daintree in far north Queensland in her early 20s, and she had a daughter named Zoe. And then tragically her daughter got cancer and she was unwell for many years, and then she died when she was 9, when Pam was 30. And Pam had been on the single mother's pension, and that got cut off because she got a letter from the government to say, well, you're no longer a mother, so you no longer qualify. And so she was just absolutely devastated and just thought, well, my life is over. I've got nothing I can do. And she had been offended by, when Zoe was very sick, kind of faith healers and, snake oil salespeople and so forth. And so she joined this group. It was a skeptics group. And through that, she kind of stumbled across something and she thought, that sounds like one of those stories you read in the paper. So she ended up deciding, I think I could do that. And so she started studying what people were writing in newspapers, and then she rang and she lied and she said, I'm a freelance journalist and I've got this story. I think it was Business Review Weekly that she rang. And they said, well, that sounds actually quite interesting. Sure, we'll take a piece on that. And so then she kind of went away and went, oh my God. And so wrote this piece, delivered it, and then just kind of copying the people. I remember she was talking about Matthew Moore and Gerard Noonan, who were great journalists. She was basically reading them every day and how are they doing this? How many people are they interviewing? How are they structuring it? And just copying. She filed this piece. BRW said to her, what is this that you've filed? You've sent us 10,000 words. We run 2,000 words. What is this? And she was like, oh, I'm sorry. Just give it back to me. And so she rejigged it, sent it off. They published it. And so then she thought, well, now I guess I am a freelance journalist. And so they said to her, if you find something else, give us a yell. And so she then went away and thought about it and found something. Anyway, eventually she was hired as a full-time journalist. And she said she went for a good 6 or so years before she told anybody what her actual true story was, and that she had kind of snuck away into journalism. And I really wanted to include that because I think a very important thing in journalism is people's background and experiences obviously lead them to see the world differently, and they see stories in different places. So, for example, if you have no experience of the NDIS or an unwell child or a person with a chronic illness, it's completely invisible to you, that world. So you don't see stories from that world. Whereas if you're immersed in it all the time, you all the time are seeing, oh, there's stories here, and so forth. And so that kind of helped dictate.
Yeah, and Pamela Williams, we've both been so lucky to have her mentoring us through the years, and I'll talk a little bit about the impact that she had on the Muster Dogs book.
Well, just because we're talking about the craft of storytelling.
Yeah.
So when you were writing Muster Dogs and you're in this great hurry, what were you using Pamela Williams for?
Well, every day, Pam was my first reader on what I was writing, and because I was doing the book on all of the 10 participants, so the 5 in the new series and the 5 from the past series, and I didn't have time to be sitting there going over it and mulling over what I'd written. I printed out a calendar like this of the 4 months that I had, and every day I would write on it 1,200 words today, 1,200 words, and I would follow that, and I would not go to bed at night until I had written those 1,200 words, because I knew that if I let one day go, it'd be 2,400 the next day. And it reminds me that of a great story. When I first started the memoir, Daring to Fly, and Louise Adler, who of course we need to thank for making the Adelaide Writers' Festival so wonderful this year. And quite frankly, I saw Louise just before, and she came up to me and said, she is so dog phobic that I should be lucky that I'm here being allowed to talk about dogs. Thankfully, there are a lot of people who love dogs. But when I first approached writing a memoir, I had no idea what to do. I'd done a bit of writing, and Leigh, of course, had written Detainee 002 on David Hicks, and I spoke to a few friends about approaching writing a memoir. I downloaded on Kindle books that people had written how to write a memoir. But one of the most helpful bits of advice was from Sally Hepworth, the author, who was doing a podcast with Mia Friedman. And Mia asked Sally, how does she write? What is her success for whipping out New York Times bestsellers every year? And Sally told Mia, she said, oh, well, it's the it's the dirty 330 is how I approach it. I wake up every morning and I write 330 words before I even put the jug on for a cup of coffee. And I just go, look, they may not be the best words that you're ever going to write. They may be a bit dirty and need a bit of cleaning up and polishing later, but you will start your day always having 330 words. And I eventually met Sally after the memoir had come out and Mia introduced us, and I said to Sally, your advice saved me. Like every morning I would get up and I would write the dirty 330. And there was a pause and Sally looked at me and said, it's the nifty 350. And I blushed and she then said, are you writing a porn book? So then we started coming up with all these other ones. We go, oh, we could have the naughty 340. There's no end to this. But it did get me through. And yes, so Pam, when I was writing Muster Dogs, I would send her copies of everything I'd written, part chapters, every day. And what she would do, because as a journalist, and on News Breakfast, I'm used to condensing everything. When we write a news package, it's a minute 40. When I'm interviewing someone, whether it's Henry Winkler or Rod Stewart or the Prime Minister, you have got a limited amount of time. So back to that whole clock and time with Salesy and me is that I'm very conscious of making things tight. And Pam would look at my writing and just absolutely urge me to add the colour and bring the narrative alive. And she did it not by just saying, you know, add some colour. She would come up with the suggestions. For an example, I did a chapter in Muster Dogs about why people in the city should care about what was happening on farms. And it was a pretty dry chapter, and it was an interview with the head of the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Statistics. And I know, right? And so I kind of had it, you know, funnily enough, the chapter had statistics in it. And I thought, oh, I'm just really unhappy with this because the rest of the book is so alive with people stories and kindness, and this one is just grinding to a halt. And so I sent it to Pam, and she rang me and she said, what does he have on the walls of his office? And I said, huh? She said, just ask him what's on the walls of his office. When was the last time he was on a farm? And so I rang him back and I said, oh, Jared, I'm a little bit embarrassed. I've taken up so much of your time already, but my publishers have asked me to find out what's on the walls of your office and when was the last time you went to a farm. Anyway, he told this story about how he now takes his young sons to the farm where he used to go as a kid, and his grandparents had this farm. And he said, when I was a university student, my grandparents were losing money on this property, and I had to do a case study for my economics course, and it was about turning around a property. And so I made suggestions that my grandparents should switch from cattle to sheep. And they took my suggestion and they started making money for the first time in a long time. And he told this beautiful story and straight away became a people story.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think is absolutely the key to being a good storyteller, as well as having natural curiosity about things and following that up. It's the ability to listen and to really listen and be interested in someone. And what Pam was suggesting to you in doing that was to actually really listen to what, and to kind of dig a bit deeper into who is this person. So he's not just the CEO of Weber or whatever, he's actually, you know, a human being. And I think to say to people, listening is important is, you know, such an obvious thing to say, but you'd be surprised how few people actually listen. I mean, you hear it in the media all the time where someone's doing an interview and they're clearly just reading down a prepared list of questions instead of responding to what the other person's saying.
So that goes to gathering material, which is what we wanted to talk about. So how do you gather material?
So The first thing I do, I'll use the example of, say, preparing for an interview with the Prime Minister.
Okay.
So the first thing I do is read widely all the time, because you just never know when things you're reading might come in handy. So, for example, I happen to be at the moment reading a book about surfing. It's a surfing memoir. Next week, I'm interviewing Peter Garrett, and he used to be madly into surfing when he was young. And there's this wonderful quote in the book. It's called Barbarian Days by William Finnegan. It won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. Really recommend it. It's wonderful. There's a beautiful grab in it about the power of the ocean and how the ocean requires you, if you're a surfer, even as a child, to be completely in touch with your own physical and emotional limits. And I was thinking, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder if Garrett would relate to that, and if it might get us into talking about interesting things like mortality and religion and so forth. So reading widely. In the case of the Prime Minister or the opposition leader, you can't just get dropped on you on any given day, or you're interviewing the Prime Minister today and then go to it like you're cramming for an exam. You have to be across it all the time. So I would keep a running file where I'd be reading, and sometimes I'd go, oh, that's interesting, I'll just cut and paste that, or those statistics, that data could come in handy, I'll throw it in there. And so I would have this big messy file with a heap of bits and pieces in it. And so on the day, if I would land an interview with the Prime Minister, that's the first thing I would go to, as well as the news of the day. Because part of the problem, I think, with the news cycle is people get preoccupied with just all the sound and fury on any given day, but you want to be doing a deeper dive. So then I'd go through all of that material. Then sometimes I might ring some contacts and I might say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? I'm talking to the Prime Minister tonight. If you were talking to him, what would you want to know about? And I'd try to elicit information just through talking to people. And then I would sit down, and this is not actually dissimilar to the process of how I actually write a book either, which is I have this big amount of material, and I think about, how am I going to structure this? And in the context of, say, a prime ministerial interview, I would think, what does the average person at home want to hear from him? Not even what do I think should be asked, or what's going to make me look smart or whatever. It's what does the average person at home want to know about?
Yeah, well, that then goes to that thing that we were talking about when you go into an interview knowing a whole lot more information, but you have to try to approach it knowing that the people consuming that interview don't have that assumed knowledge.
Yeah.
And the difference, I think, with Muster Dogs, I knew nothing about the working dogs of Australia. So I was going into all of the interviews having to ask questions that helped me as a writer, because I genuinely did not know. In fact...
Which is actually perfect, because it's placing you in the position of the audience, who also, most of them presumably don't know. But then you are also writing for experts, because everyone in the book, or everyone who does know something about mustering, is going to know if you've got something wrong.
Yes, and so one of the participants, CJ, in the Northern Territory, you might remember her, fantastic Indigenous woman who runs a property with her husband, and she was trying to explain to me why her dog... Spice, she had Spice, why Spice was not working the mob as Spice should. And she was saying, well, you know, it's got to be at 9 and 12 in the mustering mob. And she said, you know what, I'm going to draw a picture and text it to you. And it was just lovely to kind of be ignorant. But the difference with Storytellers is you were going into all of the interviews knowing everything generally already.
Yeah, but what I was trying to do was to draw out other people's experience, not like just kind of... Because if I wanted to write a book about what I think about it, I could just write my own book. Whereas actually I think it's much richer to hear... Because there's so many different ways that you can tell a story or write. I mean, that brings me back to the process of prepping for an interview, which is like prepping for a book. I'm constantly amazed at all the different processes people have. So for me... Same with an interview or a long piece of writing, I have to kind of do a big blurt first of all. So say, just to stick with the interview example, I'll look at all the material, I think about what's a structure that might work here, and then I write some questions. Then I might step back and look at it and go, actually, that would be better to open with, and I'll move it around. And then once I've got a basic structure, often a theme will start to reveal itself, and I'll be asking myself all the time, what is this actually about? And that, I think, is a very key thing with a piece of writing. Like Lisa was working on something the other day and she sent it to me, and I said, you've got a false beginning here. This is all irrelevant. The actual beginning's about a third of the way in, because the story's about X, Y, Z, and all this stuff up here is JKL. So once you've got that kind of structure, that really helps you excise everything that's unnecessary. And then I kind of can't, as I'm going, the thing that I find the absolute hardest is to get stuff out onto the page. And so I will write very fast and with absolute crap. And I'll even write things like...
So you've got the dirty 330.
I've got the dirty 330. I'll be writing... messy, put correct word here, because I just don't want to pause and think what is the best way, expression to use for that particular thing. And then once it's all actually on paper, then I actually really enjoy the process. I find it quite hard getting it all down, but I love the actual tightening it up and making it into a good piece of writing and polishing it. And so even say with an interview, I would sub-edit the questions the exact same way I sub-edit a piece of writing, which is to get them into the active voice, to have as few words there as possible, because particularly with a politician or anyone, nothing exposes somebody's waffling and ducking and weaving than if you are being precise like a scalpel, kind of cutting through it. And the best way to do that, sometimes I hear interviewers and I just think, shut up, like stop speaking, like just, ask why do you say that, or ask something really simple, or just go, really? Like that's sometimes all that's required. And so I would spend a great deal of effort tightening those interviews up and then arming myself with facts so that when they'd go, well, that's just a load of nonsense, Leigh, I could go, well, allow me to read to you from the Reserve Bank's annual report, or, whatever.
And I think that just goes to the heart of how different our careers have been over the years, because sometimes I'll send Leigh the rundown for News Breakfast and there'll be 13 or 14 interviews, and the thought of having time to sit and construct questions and think, how is this going to roll, is, like I'm jealous in a way.
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it, that period where you came back from London and you were hosting News Breakfast and I was still anchoring 7:30, so we were kind of bookending the day in these two jobs that are just gigantically different. And I used to look at like Lisa having to do, say, 13, 14 interviews and just think, oh my God, like the breadth of information to be across. But by the same token, I would have, say, one big set piece interview per day to do, and I would know that, well, the expectation is that the kind of thing I'm going to do on 7:30, because that's the one thing I have to do, it's got to be better than any other interview that anyone else does.
Whereas, my big interview, one of the most difficult that I've done in the past 6 months, was when Elmo came into the studio. I kid you not, you're laughing. It was very stressful because I'd interviewed Big Bird before, but that had been, Big Bird was done remotely. And so Big Bird was on Sesame Street and it was via Zoom. And so you did the interview as if you were talking to Big Bird, and that was cool, and I'd contacted my contacts to ask, what would you ask Big Bird? And my 5-year-old great niece gave me some really good ideas. But with Elmo, I don't know if there are any kids here, but like Elmo's not real. Elmo's a puppet, right? And then you had this puppet with people lying on the floor beside you that you weren't allowed to see, but you still had to interview Elmo as if Elmo was real. So you can come up with your hoity-toity preparation for the Prime Minister, and I give you Elmo instead.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, I would have done a very big deep dive through Elmo's backstory to make that work for 7:30.
It is that idea of interviewing people remotely, though, and in person, that's been interesting for both of us because we've both had some really embarrassing situations.
Yeah.
I remember the one about the laptop with you.
The laptop.
The comedian, Dave, what's his name?
Oh, God, Ricky Gervais.
Ricky Gervais. Ricky,
It's funny that when you said that, I was thinking, where's she going with this? I can't remember. And then it's because it's so horrifying. I think you just kind of...
Oh, so come on, share it with them all.
Well, my producer had set... So we did the show and we had to do an interview with Ricky Gervais after I came off air for 7:30, and he, as these very famous people are, he was super tight for time, and so you allocated 5 or 6 minutes, and so you've got to get everything you need. And so I've come running upstairs from the studio, sat down, and the idea is that I'm going to start the interview with Ricky, and it's just going to go immediately. And I come in and he's already seated, so I've already wasted like 1 minute. And then we start the interview and then the laptop dies. And because the producers had it sitting open waiting for me, didn't have it plugged into power and the battery died. And so, of course, when things go wrong in any workplace, but especially under great time pressure like that, you need to just remain silent, because anything you say is going to delay the process further. So you're often on deadline, you're sweating, but you just have to remain quiet and let people do what they do. And my producer, of course, just felt horrific. And so she's quickly getting it back up and booting it up, and I'm looking at the clock thinking I'm down to 4 minutes with Ricky Gervais, and just, you've kind of, all the rapport's gone then, you're kind of going from scratch. And so, yeah, those experiences are just kind of horrible. But things always go wrong. This is another point, actually, in Storytellers. Things always go wrong, and sometimes they make funny stories. Sometimes you get a better story out of it,
Can I share the David Tennant story?
Yeah.
It's on me. It's okay. I'm not going to embarrass her, although I've got plenty more stories to embarrass Leigh. But, I mean, these celebrity interviews that we do, when Leigh talks about it being the 5 minutes, 4 minutes, like, that is exactly what they're like. And it is so stressful. And you will often be part of hundreds of people getting ready for their 4 minutes with Daniel Craig, for example, and that was one of my first. And I sat there for 3 hours on a Friday night waiting for my turn to interview Daniel Craig. And then just a couple of weeks ago, I was interviewing John Malkovich. And so it wasn't live because they're on the other side of the world. You're doing them as a pre-recorded interview. And I sat there waiting for Juliette Binoche and John Malkovich. And I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, do I have time to duck to the toilet? And so I ducked off to the bathroom, and then straight away I hear, Lisa Millar, we're putting you through to the interview room, Lisa Millar. And I'm like, damn it. Anyway, there was another time which Leigh knows about, and it was with David Tennant, who I absolutely love and adore. And the interview was for 7 p.m. on a Wednesday night. And I'd done a lot of homework. I'd watched the show's most recent material that he was working with, and I had my list of questions, and I was pretty excited about it. And at about 3 minutes to 7, I started getting a gripping pain in my stomach. And I had the worst diarrhea you have ever experienced. And so I had to go to the toilet. And then I was like, I'm going to have to ring Michael Rowland and see whether he can quickly jump on this interview and do it, even though he had not prepared at all. Anyway, I managed to get through it, but I lay on the floor and just died a little death after that. And then I rang my bestie to share the story with her.
She did. And of course I found it highly amusing.
Yeah, Leigh wanted the details. Leigh said, what had you eaten? What was it? I said, it was corn. Corn always affects me that way. I don't know why. And honestly, I thought she is the detail woman, which goes to one of the things that persistence with storytelling and curiosity and details. Let's talk about curiosity a bit more.
Yeah, I think really great, like say Kate McClymont at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, 9 newspapers. She is a wonderful, that seems a bit strange, kind of person who has uncovered some amazing stories. So she tells an anecdote in Storytellers, which was just so wonderful, which was she got this cold call at the office from this bloke, and he was a father at a Sydney private school, and he was wound around the axle because this bloke, Michael Williams, there was something dodgy going on with him. Did you know who that is? And McClymont says, I've got no idea. And he says, he's the president of the Health Services Union, and he's a Labor Party, National Labor Party president. And he goes on about there's no way this bloke can have as much money as he's got because a union boss, they're not supposed to be paid more than their top paid member, and he and his wife travel first class around the world on overseas holidays all the time, and he drives a Mercedes, and she doesn't have a job, and they've got a beach house. But the thing that had really got up this guy's nose and made him pick up the phone to one of the nation's premier investigative journalists was that this guy, Michael Williams, constantly outbid him at the school auction night. And so McClymont thought, she thought, look, he's got an axe to grind, but that is actually kind of weird. Like, how does he have all that money?
Those
And
school
so-
auctions, man, they are tough. They are tough ground.
High stakes. And so she goes and has a look. It was actually a very straightforward thing to do if you kind of know how to do this sort of work. She goes and has a look at the HSU's last couple of annual reports, which are just on the website, and she also goes and does a company search on Michael Williams to see if he's a director of any companies. And she notes, oh, he's a director of this particular company. In the HSU annual report, that company's been paid $1.2 million a year for consultancy work. And so, cut a long story short, a few other searches and bits of investigation involved, and Michael Williams ended up going to jail. And so, yeah, that was just straight following of, because it's very easy for journos, I think, to go, oh, that's weird, and then you just get distracted and you move on to the next thing.
I can't believe people who do that, though. I'm always shocked if I meet anyone in our field who isn't inherently curious to the point of being absolutely nosy.
Yeah, well, you are the biggest sticky beak I know, which is actually a great quality for a journalist. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. One is, we recently were down in the Mornington Peninsula to do a book event about storytellers, and we stopped at this lovely country bakery and got, a sausage roll or whatever. And I said to Leigh, do you ever think like you could chuck it all in and run a country bakery? And so we had a little chat about that. And I said, I don't think I could, because they have to get up early for the baking and, for the bread and stuff, and be in at work at 3 a.m. And Lisa said, I don't think that's the case with everything. Anyway, so we go to leave. When we'd got our sausage roll, there'd been a Danish there that I'd been eyeing off. And when we got up to leave, Lisa walked back in, and I thought, she's gone to get the Danish. Anyway, so I'm waiting around for her, and then she comes out, and then she's like, well, I've checked it with the baker. It's actually, they do sourdough here, so he doesn't need to come in before 7 a.m. She's gone in and given him a solid grilling about his hours and what it involves. That's not even the worst Lisa Millar story. This one is. So one time, other than the 4 years in Washington, we've never lived in the same city in our almost 30 years of friendship. She's in Sydney briefly, and so she's got a heap of stuff on, but she says, I've got about an hour to pop into your place for a quick drink, and then can you drop me off at suchwhere else? As previously explained, she's never late. She's agreed to be here at 5. No sign of her. 10 past 5, no sign of her. By 20 past 5 and no message, I was actually feeling kind of worried. And so I rang her. And what had happened was I'd moved house a year earlier, but she hadn't updated in her phone. So she'd gone to my old address, knocked on the front door, and then Dorothy and her husband, who'd bought the house, said, oh, no, Leigh doesn't live here. And then Lisa's realised, I've got the wrong place. And they said, oh, but we know who you are. You're Lisa Millar. And so she gets chatting to her. And so when I bring her at 20 past 5, she's like, oh, well, I've gone in to have a cup of tea with Dorothy. And so she shows up at 5:45, and then I don't really have time to come in, but can you still drop me over to Steve's? And so then that's how curious she is. She knocks on a random's door and then goes and has a cup of tea with them.
Well, it does lead to amazing stories, and I'm sorry about that, Leigh. But we have had many cups of teas over the last 25 years. So just this past week, I've been on a backroads shoot in country New South Wales, and we were staying at a motel in a very small town, about an hour and a half's drive out of Sydney. And it was the kind of motel where you park your car and your nose is right up against your door, and they have an opening in the wall where someone once used to put the breakfast and slide it through. So I'm painting that picture for you. Anyway, I saw this gentleman there, an older gentleman. Most days he would go away in his car, he'd come back, but he was sitting outside, he'd have a cigarette. And I for a couple of days I thought, I wonder what he's doing. Like, what brings someone to a motel like this? Anyway, eventually my curiosity got the better of me, and I said to him, I hope you don't find this too personal a question, but I'm curious, like, what brings you here? And he told me an incredible story, which was that he'd been working overseas, he'd come back, he'd been priced out of the Sydney rental market, he was an IT consultant, and he had to go back overseas in a few months, so he only wanted a short-term rental in Sydney, could not get one, was working for an American client, and therefore was online through the night, and he thought, well, what's wrong with just going and finding a cheap motel somewhere in the country? And that's what he was doing. And we got into a really interesting conversation about rental prices in big cities and what was happening with housing. So,
and that's the source of stories. Like, that's how you do find stories as a journalist, is just following that kind of natural path of curiosity.
Yeah. The other thing I want to talk about, and you talk about it in Storytellers, and is empathy. And I never anticipated that I would become someone who covered so many horrible stories in the world, and I deal with that in Daring to Fly, which is that I ended up as a foreign correspondent. I was overseas for 12 years in the end because I loved the uncertainty of never knowing where I was going to be going to bed that night. I'd wake up in the morning and the phone call would come and you would be sent anywhere covering earthquakes or terrorist attacks or building fires, with Grenfell being an example. And I've always thought and told myself, and I wish I knew back years ago what I know now, which is treating people with respect and listening, as you've suggested, is just so key. And that it's all very well as a journalist to get someone to speak to you, but if you don't treat them respectfully, you're not going to be ever allowed back into their home. And I do take it with a bit of pride that over the years I've been able to revisit stories, whether it's the parents of a young child who was killed in the Sandy Hook school shooting, or a woman who was newly widowed after September 11, and I tracked her down for the 10th anniversary of September 11, and I said, oh, you probably don't remember me, and she said, oh, I remember you. Come on in. And, you know, I just think that is so important and something that we try to share with younger reporters.
Yeah, and I think that it's actually good. I think now there's a lot more emphasis on how you should behave with people who are, you know, because often you're dealing with traumatised people if you're involved in news reporting, and there's a lot more discussion about how you treat people and so forth, and that they're not simply a story, and how important it is to get details right, you know, spelling of people's names and so forth.
With Storytellers, or with Any Ordinary Day, the fact that you made a decision which goes against what a lot of us have been taught over the years.
Yeah, you're taught in journalism that everything somebody tells you is on the record because you've established those parameters, and then you are free to do with that, you know, within the bounds of being fair, accurate, impartial, all the rest of it. Once people have said it, they've said it. But when I was writing Any Ordinary Day, which was about the way that life can kind of suddenly change, and that a very common human experience is a blind side out of nowhere, and how humans adapt to that, and also how do you live life knowing that can happen to you at any time. The people that I interviewed for that book who'd had these experiences happen to them and very generously were kind of talking about it, you know, I could have done the interview and then I'd just write the chapter and then that's it, but And in journalism, you're taught that that is what you're supposed to do. You're not meant to give people the finished product to look at, because the thinking goes that they'll pull their punches, or they'll want you to spin it a certain way, and then they'll be pressuring you and so forth. But with this book, I felt that the stories were so, they were the key moments of these people's lives. And I also felt like, because of my profile, that it would be a very widely read book. And I did not in any way want to contribute one more second of suffering or angst to the life of anyone who had participated in this book. And so with everybody, I gave them their chapter to read, to say, I want to know what you think. Are you comfortable with it? Do you feel that it's an accurate representation of what actually happened to you? Have I listened correctly and understood what you're saying? And I think the thing is, of the people in the book, only one person asked for a change, and I felt that it was a very... The anecdote she wanted changed, it was a good anecdote, but it was something that caused her to fear she was going to upset someone in her life, and that maybe that could result in violence. And so I felt that was a perfectly legitimate reason to take it out, even though I would have preferred to run it. And so I think people actually, rather than attempt for me to spin them better or to do whatever, I think that they respected the chance to offer some feedback. And then I'm very comfortable then when that book goes into the world that I feel that everyone in it, has I've treated them well and that they're comfortable with what's going out there. And the thing I think for the people who participated in that book and that I've tried to let them all know is, I mean, that book came out in 2018. Not a week goes past still that somebody does not contact me about that book to say, this happened to me and somebody gave me this book, or I read your book and it helped me process and it helped me understand, it helped me feel less alone. And that's because the people in the book had the generosity to actually dig deep into their own experiences and talk about, you know, what life's like 1 year after a tragedy, or 5 years, or 20 years, and so on. And I think it gives people hope that, you know, like Lisa and I are both friends with Walter Mikac, who's one of the people in the book who, I don't know if you remember, is a man whose wife and 2 little girls were killed in Port Arthur. And that was now, 25 years ago. And Walter, I feel so happy when I see him, because it just makes me think, my God, human beings are able to carry a lot of pain but still have joy, and that all of that can coexist at once. And I look at Walter and I think, if somebody can get through what you got through and carry that inside you, of course, and still have pain from that, but have a productive, happy life, then that's just absolutely fantastic.
What I wanted to do with Muster Dogs was to bring a behind the scenes for people who'd watched the show and loved it. And I wanted to really explore those people's stories. And there are stories that are so gutting about things that they had lived through their life. And
so did you let them read it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You've given me the confidence to do that.
Right.
I remember when you said With Any Ordinary Day that you had done that, and I thought, I am now going to always do that. And honestly, sometimes it is a fact here or there, and I don't want anything incorrect in a book.
Especially in a book, because it's so permanent. Whereas what we do in our daily job, it's you still want it to be accurate, of course, but it comes and it's gone, you know.
Well, I mean, with the memoir Daring to Fly, I sent multiple versions through to my siblings. There are 5 of us, and with Mum and Dad not being around anymore. And it was great, the feedback. Most of it was constructive, until we realised right at the very end that one of my brothers hadn't read any of it and discovered that there were stories in there about him that he absolutely did not want in the book. So there was a little bit of rewriting going on. So, look, I just want to finish up by kind of dwelling on, I guess, what we've learned over the years, because as you've alluded to, we've all made mistakes. I think of one particular story that I did in Washington, which involved a plane crash in the US and the death of a young woman who was the second in command on that plane. And I felt that I did cause more grief to the family, and I wish I could change history, but I can't. But what we can do is to approach everything that we do with our jobs now with what we have learned over the years. And for me, it's respect, and it's kindness, and it's empathy. And
did you think that mistake was basically a failure of empathy? Because when I look back at my own career, I feel like often the things I wish I'd done a bit differently was, I think you could characterise it as a failure of empathy, often because I was distracted because I was under time pressure, I was in a hurry to get somewhere else, and so just rushed, didn't think things through, cut somebody short,
I was excited by the story and had forgotten the impact of what I was doing.
Right.
And the late, great, beautiful friend of ours, Mark Colvin, he gave me so much great advice, and he said to me that he thought I had become a far more empathetic reporter over the years, and I hung on to that compliment, and I wear it with pride that that's what he said.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's partly because as you get older you have more of your own life experience, and so you realise how fleeting life can be, how suddenly things can change. You realise how lucky you are sometimes to have ducked certain things and how random life can be. And so I think that generally makes you a more empathetic human being, because you realise how easily your position could be changed with somebody else's. I mean, I think, to go back to your question about, what have I learned over the years, I think probably I would say that life is for almost everyone, and there's different degrees of difficulty, of course, but life is by nature kind of hard because it's going to end in death, right? So it's just hard. That's a hard truth. And so you can try to insulate yourself and to have an easy life, but there's just no way to do it. So I feel like you might as well throw yourself at life and embrace things and actually just live life to the fullest and do things that scare you and all of the rest of it, because you only get the one go around. And so you never know when it's going to end. And so I think it's good to be bold and be out there. The other thing, that I feel like I've learned is that a lot of things that feel bad at the time, there are genuinely bad experiences in life, but a lot of things that feel like a big deal at the time turn out to actually be kind of funny in hindsight. So say like the late day at the Pentagon, then that's just a funny story down the track. Also, for you. Another thing is that kindness really, really matters, because sometimes you just don't know what other people are going through, and even just the most random act of kindness can actually really assist somebody who's going through something. It doesn't even have to be a big act of kindness. And then also I think gratitude, and just realising that, you know, often when I would interview people to whom something terrible had happened, they would start the story by saying, well, it was just an ordinary day. And that was because they couldn't believe that what happened next, that there was no sign. You know, they'd often talk about, oh, it was a beautiful day in South Australia and so forth. And it kind of rattles people, because they feel like, wow, I thought there might be a warning that my life was about to change momentously. And so the reality is, when something like that's happened to people, they often will look back to the time before this, and all those ordinary days seem super magical. The days that you just got to go to the park and go to Writers' Festival, or you had a tasty coffee, or you had a nice swim. Those days are, in hindsight, magical, and it's good to be appreciative of that at the time.
Well, we are now going to have to wrap up. So I want to say that I am grateful that you agreed to meet me in the lobby 10 minutes early so we could be here in plenty of time. I am grateful. I want to give a big shout out to the chatters amongst you all, because I'm grateful for the joy that Chat 10 has brought into Leigh's life and mine as well in that family group. And I'm grateful.
We're signing books?
Oh, yeah, no, we're signing books. I hadn't finished with my gratefulness.
Sorry.
Man, who's the chair here? Oh, that's right. Hey, we are going to be signing books in that direction. We're near the book selling tent, so you can buy copies of Any Ordinary Day, Storytellers, Muster Dogs, Daring to Fly, and that's where we're heading now. Thank you so much. Thank you for those who've been out in the sun there. We've really appreciated it.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.